He marched not as a man, but as a tempest, leaving empires in shambles, ravaging cities, and marking his name on the skin of history. Alejandro de Macedonia, Alejandro Magno, was no conqueror. He was a force that rewrote the edges of the world known by fire, blood, and indomitable ambition. His victories are etched upon legend, but beneath the legend of victory lies a darker heritage of horror and devastation, concealed behind the awe of the centuries. When kings desire to be gods, there is no place for mercy. What followed him was not redemption, but devastation, a legacy tempered in cruelty, forged in time by war. Cities were left in ruins under his leadership. In 335 BC, the city of Thebes, which was considered one of the strongest and symbolic cities of ancient Greece, was still difficult for a growing power to challenge. His citizens felt that they were able to hold off the wave of Macedonian power. They were mistaken. Alejandro Magno, 21 years old, heard of Theban rebellion and did not react with diplomacy, but with rapid ferocity and crushing force. Alejandro's armies marched upon Thebes within days, encircling it with skill and ferocity. The attack was swift. The city's renowned walls, which were deemed unbeatable, were brought down to rubble by siege machines and incessant infantry. Thebes was captured, not by a drawn-out siege, but as an act of terrorism designed to quash the very idea of defying between the city-states of Greece. Ancient historian Diodorus Siculus described Alejandro as completely destroying the city, sparing only the temples and the house of poet Pindaros. Everything else was ashes. Approximate 30,000 Thebans were killed or sold into bondage. Families were torn apart, homes left in ruins, and Thebes, the former pride of the Boeotian, was wiped off the political map. This was not a war necessity. This was a conscious display of power. Alejandro's message was clear. Resistance would be annihilated. Thebes was a warning engraved on the conscience of Greece. A city not just defeated, but obliterated, to make sure that fear prevailed where rebellion had ended. Mass executions following capitulation. In 332 BC, the island stronghold of Tyre, the jewel of Phoenicia, had the temerity to resist Alejandro. Safe behind high walls and encircled by the Sea of the Mediterranean, Tyre was considered invincible. His refusal to surrender was not only a matter of defiance. It was a challenge to Alejandro's rule in its most personal sense. This was followed by one of the most brutal sieges in the ancient world. For 7 merciless months, Alejandro's troops labored to construct a massive dike that would link the mainland with the city gates, subject to relentless bombardment and horrifying loss. When the walls were breached, Alejandro's wrath was unleashed in all its fury. Historian Quinto Curcio Rufo estimated the number of shooters killed in the final attack at around 6,000. But the carnage didn't end with the victory. Alejandro still crucified around 2,000 other men, probably prisoners of war, along the coast, a macabre warning to anyone who was watching from afar. Women and children, about 30,000 of them, were enslaved. It was not a gesture of revenge. It was a deliberate act of punishment. The siege of Tyre had stalled the conquest of Alejandro of the Persian Empire, and because of this the city had to pay the highest price. The slaughter in Tyre was not just a crushing blow for the Phoenicians, but a message to the entire world. Surrender now or suffer complete destruction. The previously powerful Tyre, with its sea power and independence, was reduced to silence, its people gone, its resistance crushed into the dust of imperial ambition. Forced marches that claimed thousands of lives. In 325 AD, as Alexander the Great led his armies back from the confines of his empire in India, he made a decision that was to prove fateful. Instead of following a shorter and safer route north, he chose to cross the Hydrosian Desert, the current region of Makran, in southern Iran and Pakistan. Ancient geographers called it an unproductive and cruel extension, since it was characterized by a lack of water, scorching heat, and hard terrain. Alexander's task, according to historians like Arriano, was to defeat the accomplishments of ancient Persian kings, especially Cyrus the Great, who had failed to traverse the region. What resulted was not a war campaign, but a creeping catastrophe. Tens of thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and pack animals perished, not in battle, but from exhaustion, thirst, and starvation. Arriano informs us that the heat was so fierce that many perished where they stood, and ancient sources assert that only a fraction of the army succeeded in crossing. The stores were exhausted, wells were poisoned or dried up, and sandstorms engulfed whole columns. It was not a war tragedy, but the direct consequence of Alexander's ambition and pursuit of glory. He led his people to a moat to have his name remembered in history at any human expense. The March of Hydrosia is among the most agonizing forced marches of the ancient world, a grueling trek that saw no tactical advantage, but only death and misery. In his quest to equal the legends, Alexander forged one of his own, drenched not in bloodshed in combat, but in the unspoken cost of lives lost before unforgiving terrain. Whole populations enslaved as penance. In 332 AC, when Alexander moved into the Levant, the walled city of Gaza, a strategic point of entry into Egypt and the vast Persian Empire, lay directly in his path. Unlike most cities that had surrendered, Gaza's commander, Battus, a devoted Persian nobleman, would not capitulate. The fortifications of the city, constructed on a mound and enclosed by massive walls, made the siege a nasty test of will. Alexander's army bombarded the city with siege engines for 2 months, with tactic losses in successive attacks. When Gaza eventually surrendered, Alexander's reaction was merciless and brutal. The ancient author Quintus Curtius Rufus reports that Battus was taken alive, and in a deliberate display of savagery, Alexander instructed him to be dragged bound to a chariot along the walls of the city, copying the treatment of Achilles to Hector in the Homeric tradition. But punishment was not limited to leadership. The entire Gaza population, both men, women, and children, were sentenced to slavery. It is estimated that some tens of thousands were sold into slavery, forcibly removed from their homes and distributed throughout the Hellenic world. This was not an act of war that was required. It was a message penned in chains. The enslavement of Gazans was a brutal warning to others, demonstrating the cost of resistance. What had been a flourishing was turned into a symbol of vengeance, its citizens erased from the earth they had fought to protect. In his endeavor to build an empire, Alexander demonstrated that mercy was in his definition conditional, and that rebellion would be punished not just with death, but with the loss of the liberty of an entire city. Cultural landmarks destroyed to suppress the uprising. Alexander the Great in 330 BC entered Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Achaemenid Persian Empire, designed as an architectural marvel with towering columns and elaborate reliefs. Persepolis was more than a city. It was the symbol of Persian identity, power, and divine royalty. Its marvelous palaces and halls, particularly the renowned Apollodona, witnessed centuries of imperial rule. Following his capture, Alexander first treated Persepolis with respect, permitting his troops to loot its vast wealth, but preserving its buildings. But this discord would not endure for long. At a drunken feast, as described by the ancient historian Diodorus Siculus, Alexander was convinced, perhaps by the courtesan Thais, to burn the city's palace complex. Others, including Plutarch, hold that it was an act of vengeance for the burning of Athens by the Persians during the Median Wars. Revenge or drunkenness, the outcome was catastrophic. The fires devoured the essence of Persian civilization, leaving temples, libraries, and centuries of documents in ashes. It was not merely the destruction of buildings. It was the symbolic destruction of the heart of an empire. By setting Persepolis alight, Alexander not only raised the physical center of Persian might, but also its legacy. Even if subsequent narratives dispute his remorse, the act is one of the greatest instances of ancient cultural devastation. In his desperate desire to create a new world, Alexander bequeathed smoking ruins as testament, suggesting conquest was tallied not in victories, but in ruined cultures. History remembers Alexander the Great as a visionary warrior, a military mastermind who reshaped the ancient world. But beneath his victories was a trail of destruction so immense that its reverberations echoed far beyond the battlefield. Destroyed cities, enslaved populations, cultural heritage left to ashes. Each action is a testament to the devastating price of the empire. They were not random actions, but calculated actions which demonstrate to what extremes ambition will propel a man, even to the best of men. Power, once acquired, typically exacts a toll not only from the vanquished, but from the victor's own soul as well. When reflecting on this legacy, we have a deeper question. Can the glory of conquest ever surpass the human cost it imposes? Tell us, was Alexander's brutal path a necessity of the empire or a warning about limitless power? In Plutarch's words, his ambition was so great and the world he conquered, a legacy forged in both greatness and ruin that still burns in the annals of time.